días. Muchas gracias por su invitación. Lo siento porque no hablo español muy bien. Quizás me sentiré más cómodo hablando español a finales de semana. Pero hoy en inglés. I am very grateful to be welcomed by strangers. I did not know anyone here before I came, so it is very moving to be welcomed by people that I have no previous contact with. And it's one of those wonderful things about the academic world and the world of critical thought that you can be entertained by strangers and welcomed into their presence. So I'm grateful for that. So I'm speaking today about surveillance after Snowden. This is Edward Snowden, the young American who was an operator, a worker at the National Security Agency in the US. So I'm saying some things about him.
This is the first time that I've spoken in a context of a center committed to studies of violence and complexity. And it seems to me there are some important connections to be made between the two. Can you hear me okay? Is it all good? Sounds good to me. The origins of the technologies on which contemporary surveillance depends are military origins. They were created in the first place for the sake of state-orchestrated violence. The metaphors by which contemporary surveillance operates are also military ones. We talk about a war on terror, a war on drugs, and the kinds of surveillance that have developed in the 21st century came originally from something called a Cold War. So the metaphors that underlie much surveillance are very much ones that are associated with violence. And the consequences of contemporary surveillance are also frequently touched by violence. So that, for example, when individuals after 9/11 were under rendition to another country, they experienced torture. There is also a form of psychological violence that occurs with much surveillance because it is associated with intimidation and exclusion. So there are several ways in which I think speaking about surveillance in this context is a good one, because there are clear connections between what is done at the center here and or the institute here, I should say, and the sort of work that we do. Like yours, I come from a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary context, and we work together with a number of different people from different disciplinary areas. My own background, originally as an undergraduate in literature studies, and then in history, and then I ended up teaching in sociology, and the university for which I worked a few years ago invited me to be a professor also in the law faculty. That should be an encouragement to your students. Sometimes you can end up teaching things for which you have no qualifications whatsoever. It's sometimes smoke and mirrors, as we say in English. Anyway, the multidisciplinarity, I think, is really important. The idea that we can work together on a common project with different disciplinary perspectives and commitments, I think is tremendously important. We enjoy it in our Center for Surveillance Studies in Canada, and obviously, talking with some of you, there is a good transdisciplinary context here too. Among the disciplines that we include are two that I haven't heard in conversation yet. One is technological studies, not just studies of technology from the social sciences, but technological studies, meaning people in computer science, in software design, those kinds of areas. I just haven't heard this yet, but perhaps they are here. But it's really important for us in the social sciences and humanities, if we're trying to understand surveillance, to have some contact with and knowledge of those who are working within areas such as software design and engineering and so on. That's one very important connection. The other is one that perhaps I think this thing is alive in more than one sense. I will keep it under surveillance. I'm very easily distracted, and hey, we will be off the point before we know it. The other area that I'm interested in, but also once we had a visitor to our Surveillance Studies Center, not only from the disciplines that have been mentioned here, but also from theology. And there's one person who has actually written some theology of surveillance. And I commend his work to you too. Very interesting. He wrote part of it when he was at our center. And I think it's just called Theological Perspectives on the Surveillance Society. And he draws, for example, on feminist theories of care and a number of other perspectives, and draws it together in a theology of surveillance. And I have a lot of sympathy also with the work that he's doing. So perhaps I also hear voices and share commitments with others even beyond the disciplines that I've heard talked about here. Anyway. Okay, so let's talk about Edward Snowden. There he is, 29 years old when he began to disclose that which he had been working on as a contractor for the NSA. That photograph was one that was used when Snowden was speaking a live stream in Toronto a few weeks ago. And in fact, one of my PhD students asked a question during the interchange. As you may have seen, Snowden has made a number of public appearances, and several of them have been involving university and even high school contexts where people have been able to ask him questions despite the fact that he is hiding in an apartment in Moscow, in Russia. So that was in March. So what he's been doing is an ongoing staggered release of secret documents. So he was working as a contractor, and he had access because he had high-level security clearance. He had access to an amazing number of documents. And as he worked there as a person involved in surveillance for the NSA, which he believed was appropriate, and he does it as a patriotic American, he began to see ways in which the surveillance that he was being obliged to work with was, one, beyond what was permitted within the rules of the NSA, and two, matters that he believed were inconsistent with the Constitution of the USA. And so for two reasons, he began to feel very troubled about what he was working with from day to day, even though, in principle, he was content to work within the NSA and believed that the sorts of things that he was doing were appropriate. But he became very disturbed by what he saw. He spoke to his superiors about these things that seemed inconsistent, both constitutionally and in terms of NSA rules. And eventually, when no one would listen to him, he decided on a different route. He decided that he was going to release the documents to the public. He was going to take them from his workplace, illegally, of course, and he believed that the constitutional irregularities and the rule breaking within the NSA was so significant and so egregious that he had to act in civil disobedience, doing what was illegal for the sake of the common good. So that's what Snowden believed he was doing, and in many interviews and so on that you can read or see online, you'll hear him saying the same kinds of things. And so he decided to release these starting in June 2013, and he decided, differently from some previous whistleblowers, that he was going to hand the materials over to journalists whom he respected. And so he wasn't going to be the person revealing the documents' contents himself. He was going to allow them to choose which documents should be released first and in what order they would be released. Of the many, many documents that he released, a very small proportion has been made public. So the figures are a bit difficult to follow, but there were about 58,000 documents to which he had access that he took, and he believed that none of them would jeopardize national security in the United States, although of course that became debatable after he had done it. And he believed that the best people to release the documents would be journalists. So that's what he did. And as I said, he appears from time to time and discusses with various people. I should say I have not had a chance directly to discuss with him. I have sent him some materials, and I've been in touch with other people who are associated with him, like one of the journalists, or Poitras. I'm in touch with her, but I personally have not been directly in touch with him. That is to say, I've been in touch with him, he hasn't been in touch with me. Might happen, but not yet. And revelations, these things that we are learning about the National Security Agency and its operations, which, as you see from my title, Global Surveillance in a Post-Snowden World, it is not just the NSA, it is a network of agencies throughout the world who are doing the surveillance that he describes. He can speak only directly to what the NSA does, but the documents show ways in which similar agencies in other countries do very similar things, frequently in conjunction with the NSA. And so they produced a global response, often of outrage against what has been revealed for many, many reasons. I'll try to explain some of those as we go along. It is highly secretive, which is why he believed it was necessary to expose what was happening. And it is mass surveillance. That is to say, it uses certain kinds of techniques that go far beyond how surveillance was defined in earlier decades. So in the 1950s and 1960s, during the Cold War, mass surveillance was only partly possible. Usually it was some form of targeted surveillance, where those who were already suspected of some kind of criminal wrongdoing or of some seditious or some kind of behavior that was negatively construed by the nation state, that made somebody a target. And there is a huge difference between targeted surveillance under certain strict rules and mass surveillance, which is promiscuous and which covers everyone. No one is exempt. Not only that, mass surveillance is not merely surveillance of who we are, our identities, not merely of sorts of things we are engaged in that become visible in the words of our communications, like our telephone calls, for example. You can discover something through a wiretap that was part of a telephone conversation. Today, we are far beyond that kind of level. That still happens, but mass surveillance today involves tracking patterns of behavior in which groups of people are implicated, and then by extension, individuals within those groups are associated with the group. So it's rather like Facebook social graph, and in fact, Facebook social graph is of great interest to the NSA and other kinds of agencies. So in a curious way, the corporate and the state forms of surveillance have come together in what is today mass surveillance. We can talk more about that later. Okay, so what do the government documents reveal? I think three things are crucial concerning what those documents reveal. The first is that governments spy on their own citizens. Now, conventionally, traditionally, acts of espionage were acts directed against foreigners perceived as enemy entities. Within commonly accepted democratic practice during the 20th century, by and large, the idea of spying, keeping tabs on domestic populations by agencies of government was prohibited or at least limited. And the idea that you could spy on your own citizens was something that was outside of what most agencies were supposed to do. And of course that excludes governments that did not make any pretense of democracy. So within totalitarian regimes of different kinds, within state socialist regimes, perhaps most prominently places like East Germany until 1989, in those kinds of places that did not pretend to be democratic, of course you spied on your own citizens, because that's how political and social order was maintained in part. But the idea of spying on your own citizens within countries that claim to be democratic is thought of as being a clash with democratic principles. Secondly, internet and telephone companies share data. Now, how this happens is very complicated and is still the matter of considerable controversy, legal debate, technical questioning. There are many aspects of the ways in which telephone companies and internet companies work with intelligence agencies and security agencies is something that is not fully known. It is a topic for the kinds of disciplinary areas that we are in to find out how exactly these relationships emerge. We know some things, but we really don't know an awful lot about some of the details of how the two work together. And so when I say share data, you might ask the question, well, did they do it voluntarily? Did they decide they were going to share data? Were they asked to? Were they obliged to? Was the fact that, let's say, Google had a relationship with the American government already because they already sold services to government departments? Did that mean that they felt obliged also to share data with the government because they already had contractual commercial relationships with the government? We don't know the answers to all those questions. So how far it was voluntary, how far it was constrained, how far the companies themselves knew what was going on, how far the leaders of the agencies involved knew exactly what was going on at a contractual level between the corporations and the agencies. We don't know. There are many things that we don't know. We discovered many things that are troubling through these disclosures. And of course, one of the first things was that there was a sense of consumer trust being broken. You mean to say that the things that I post on Facebook, the things that I Google, the things that for which I'm using Twitter or Instagram or any of these other platforms, do you mean that what I am doing here is somehow open to government departments? What's going on here? So many people felt that their trust in the corporation had been betrayed because what they thought was governed by those terms of access that very few people read, but if you do read them, you discover that you're supposed to be protected from your data being spread in a broadcast way to other kinds of agencies. That is a breaking of trust. So violating democratic practice in government spying on their own citizens, breaking consumer trust in the second. Third, ordinary telephone users and internet users generate the kinds of data that are sought by the NSA. And this, for one thing, creates a chilling effect in which you can no longer be quite sure that when you do post something or make a telephone call, that it is as confidential between you and the person or between you and the group that you thought that your communication was limited to. So there's a sense of a chill, and we can talk more about that later. I plan to talk more about it this afternoon in the seminar. And this fact of those data being sought by the NSA is, as I said a few minutes ago, quite surprising and quite interesting. For example, over many years since the Cold War, when so-called signals intelligence was developed, this was the interception of communications through wiretaps and using satellites for communication between one country and the next. All those kinds of things had to do with signals intelligence. And there are a number of different kinds of signals intelligence that grew up from the Second World War, especially onwards. Over the last few years, that is to say years of the 21st century, there is a new category within those intelligence agencies that simply did not exist in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and that is called OSINT. And OSINT stands for Open Source Intelligence. That is to say, a whole new category has been invented of that which, if you have access to telephone and internet, is open source. And that has become area is the development of intelligence agencies internationally. So OSINT is a whole new way of thinking about what earlier was much more constrained and circumscribed. The very term, OSINT, open source surveillance, suggests that there is nothing which is not usable for surveillance purposes. So, those are the three things that I think are important in what the documents reveal. How does the NSA work? Well, again, three ways. Which is not really the influence of the theology that I was mentioning before, but it is interesting that lots of things come in threes. Sorry, I'm being distracted. Intercepting data in transit is the first. So, so-called upstream programs, such as one called Fairview, can tap into internet fiber optic cables. And here's one of the slides that was released by Snowden. If what Snowden did was illegal, then every time we show slides, it's probably also illegal. But here it is. Now you are complicit in the illegality. But what you see here is the pattern, the basic pattern, which shows that, again, the global spread through fiber optic cables over land and submarine that basically encircle the globe. And so what the NSA and the other agencies can do is to tap into those fiber optic cables themselves. So where the data streams go, it is possible for the agency simply to tap into them and to remove data, to intercept data as they flow. They can also get access to stored data. And here again we see how the agencies can't really act without contact with and some kind of collusion with the corporate bodies, the companies. And here's another of the slides that, the many, many thousands of slides that have been revealed. PRISM is one of the best known ones now because of the revelations. And PRISM is a data mining program for exploring within those databases of the large corporations. And again, you can see advertised across the top of the slide many of the names that are very well known. These are all companies that have been shown to be complicit in some way with NSA, and by which I mean many other agencies, surveillance, in recent years. So this means that it's possible to check through in quite complicated and sophisticated ways the very databases that we interact with all the time. And then a third way, so this is understanding it in a sense in a technical fashion, which is why I say we need to understand how these things happen technically. So first, fiber optic cables is my focus, and then the data mining program on stored data. And then the third way is installing spyware on individual computers. And this goes even further than many people who have studied the intelligence agencies realize. There is far greater use of this method than was previously recognized. So programs such as quantum insert used to plant malware or spyware into specific systems. The SIM cards business that was revealed earlier this year, 2015, Gemalto, I think it was revealed last year. So in the Gemalto case, there were employees at, I don't know the name of the corporation, but anyway, in Belgium, Belgicom, there you go. Belgicom operatives arrived at work one day and among other things, flicked on their LinkedIn screens so that they could see their LinkedIn contacts. Some people use LinkedIn, you know, it's amazing. But there they were, they clicked on their LinkedIn screens. And the screens came up, and these are technical people. The screens came up, and they just used them as if they were their regular screens. They were not. They were NSA planted screens. They were fake screens. They looked like their LinkedIn page, but they were not. But in those moments where they had logged on, that was the moment that I think it was through the GCHQ, the British equivalent of NSA, and they had planted malware into those computers of the technicians. So in other words, they'd gotten right into the core of Belgicom, which is the national telecommunications body in Belgium. From there, they were able to obtain contact with the machines of the routers. So the routers that connect the different machines together for the internet data to flow. From there, it was a short step to being able to put malware into the actual individual machines of people who were connected through the routers. So in other words, planting malware that then sends signals back from your own machine to the agency is what was made possible through this third way, installing spyware on individual computers. So those three, if you like, technical ways are important to think about because they're different tactics, if you like, different strategies for engaging in surveillance activities. This slide is actually left over from a trip that I was just on. I was recently a visiting professor at the University, at University in Ramallah last time. And, but I thought I would keep it in for you because there are some interesting connections here. So I'll just run through this very quickly. There's an agreement between the NSA and the Israeli equivalent. Privacy was supposed to be respected, but raw data was still passed from the US to Israel. In April 2013, there was a cyber partnership with the Defense Intelligence Special Operations Division and Mossad, the secret service, secret police in Israel. And the priority was Palestinian terrorism. I can report that in the time that I was a visiting professor in Ramallah, I never encountered anyone who was the most remotely like a terrorist. In fact, we experienced wonderful hospitality from our dear Palestinian friends, and had a good time. August 2014. I hope you remember what was happening last summer in a place called Gaza. As well as cash, weapons, technologies for surveillance, the NSA assists directly with the intelligence enabling military action. So in other words, if you remember the horrific sights from the assault on Gaza in 2014, among other things, that was directly enabled by NSA surveillance, working in conjunction with Israeli surveillance, and in turn working in collaboration, at least with the Palestinian Authority, because it's very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to do anything except in conjunction with the Israelis. So, and then there's a curious twist at the end. The NSA also sees Israel as a threat to U.S. national security and to regional peace. So things are never straightforward. That's why you have an Institute for Violence and Complexity Studies. It's pretty complex. However, one of the interesting things here, I think, is that I was speaking at Universidad University about surveillance and settler colonialism and the connection between the two. and how the kinds of surveillance that occur within settler colonialism are not necessarily just the same as any other kind of surveillance. It has particular forms. So I think that in a context like this, where there are questions about colonialism, post-colonialism, anti-colonialism, there are interesting connections to be made with other colonial environments, where there are also anti-colonial activities and movements. So I included or left that slide in just to make that little point. Or a big point, depending. 3 research questions. 1, research disregard. By this I mean, we have been studying surveillance at the Surveillance Studies Center. Well, we had our first research seminar on surveillance in 1993. So we've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. There have been a number of people doing fascinating research within the social sciences and humanities on surveillance since the 1980s, even beginning in the 1970s, but really in the 1980s onwards. So why, given all that research, all that study of what was going on in the surveillance world, why, when Snowden makes some revelations, is it suddenly a kind of global shock? It's suddenly a surprise to everyone. Well, of course, in the social sciences, perhaps we overestimate the receptivity of our own work. Perhaps we think that what we do actually makes a difference. We always hope it does, but I don't know. There are many ways in which we knew many of the kinds of activities that Snowden revealed, but they were not taken to heart. They were not seen as being politically and socially relevant, significant, whatever. So Snowden ends up being a bit of a surprise. So that's the first thing that I call research disregard. Why was there so little response to what we knew already about surveillance and what we've been trying to argue in many contexts? Secondly, research deficit. It seems to me that from a surveillance studies point of view, there are certain things revealed by Snowden that show us where we should be putting some of our energies. Some of the things that he has shown are indeed things that we didn't know about, at least in such detail, before, and those ought to become priorities for our research. And thirdly, research direction. What will unify responses to surveillance after Snowden? Let me say a little bit about each of those. Research disregard. Much work has been done, and yet little outcry. State and police surveillance, economic, consumer surveillance, actually drew not very much attention. Tended to be momentary, cause célèbre. Some specific thing was seen as scandalous, and then it disappeared out of the news again. One of the interesting things about Snowden revelations is they keep happening. I was going to say it's like a soap opera. It's not like a soap opera at all, but it keeps happening. It's like a mini-series. The next one has yet to come, and you wonder what the next one is going to be. Privacy, often considered as an individual matter, and this is something that I think is tremendously important. In the Western world especially, the idea of privacy is very prominent, but it's frequently taken to be a highly individualized matter. It's my privacy, not privacy related to the common good. And Snowden shows that there is a threat to democracy and a threat to politics itself. So research disregard. Research deficit. Well, digital infrastructures. The cloud is not fluffy. The use of the metaphor cloud for where your Google documents go, or whatever the thing is that you send, the platform is that you use to send your documents somewhere so that wherever you are, you can bring them down again. It is made to sound as if it's something up there, out there, fluffy, ethereal, inconsequential, and a cloud sometimes sends rain, which is a great blessing. So, clouds are not a very good metaphor for these things that are actually very solid entities. We're talking about server farms. Do you know that in several of the server farms that are cloud centers, these entities, long, low buildings with dozens and dozens of electronic banks of machines that are electronically operated to handle the cloud, these use the amount of energy that a small city would use. Just the installation uses the kinds of power that a small city would use. These are solid material entities that we're talking about. And it's crucial for us to think about that. Actual cables, actual solid server banks, boomerang loops. Let me just show you these. Okay, maybe you can't see that very well, but the top red dot is Toronto. The one on the right is New York, and the one on the left is Chicago. Okay, so the importance of the solidarity, the solidity, the materiality of the cable systems, the routes that are involved. A colleague at the University of Toronto would communicate with the government of Toronto, because in Canada, education is provincially organized. So somebody at Toronto University would communicate with somebody in the government of Toronto, which is like 2 blocks away. Just a few meters apart from each other. We send a message, but it doesn't go there as you could walk with it in 10 minutes if you took it by hand. It goes to New York or Chicago. It's routed through these cable routes. And the moment it crosses the Canadian border, it's under the jurisdiction of the USA. No longer under Canadian law, no longer under the control of Canadian people, despite the fact it's just a message from a colleague in Toronto at the university to the government. So you can see immediately the importance of the cables and where they go. And if you look at where the cables go around the world, and if you look at US control of those cables around the world, it is highly significant where they go. So the materiality of the cloud, so-called, is crucially important. So hybrid surveillance agencies, who conducts the surveillance is no longer clear anymore. We talk about NSA, but if Google and Yahoo and Microsoft and all these other corporations are involved, who's really doing it? The agencies are really corporate governmental hybrids. They work together. There's a political economy of these agencies that, again, is a huge issue yet to be fully researched, yet to be more than scratch the surface of in the social sciences. And of course, the tissues that connect the surveillance agencies and practices relate to us, the ordinary users of these devices and systems. And there's a paradox of privacy in the apparent willingness to share in online platforms and the chilling effects on people as they do so. Okay. Research direction. Greenwald, in his book on Snowden, which came out last year, says internet freedom, the ability to use the network without institutional constraints, social or state control, and pervasive fear is central to the fulfillment of its promise. That is to say, the promise of those who, in its post-military phase, invented the internet. And he says converting the internet into a system of surveillance thus guts it of its core potential. The internet, then, thirdly, is a vital area for analysis, focus for political action, and the pivot for potential change. So in those 3 ways, it seems to me there are tremendous challenges for us in the social sciences and humanities to think about the direction of research. And again, it means that we need that multidisciplinary approach where people in communications, technology, technology studies, and so on, get together to talk with those in political science and sociology, anthropology, psychology, and so on. Now, we didn't define surveillance, but just for the sake of putting it in here and making it clear where I'm coming from, I see surveillance as any focused, routine, systematic attention to personal details for entitlement, influence, control, management, protection. You could go on with the purposes. I regard surveillance as being ambiguous, that it can face in more than one direction, can be understood ethically and politically in various ways. But its ambiguity is never, ever a reason for seeing it as neutral. Surveillance is something that is always amenable to ethical scrutiny and political contestation. So it's ambiguous, but never neutral. It's a set of ancient practices. I think we can find precedents, antecedents for surveillance in many very ancient contexts, and we can learn from those earlier contexts. But of course today it is enhanced by new technologies, and that's why our technology studies are needed to show how that happens. Privacy I made mention of earlier, and it's understood also in a variety of ways. I have a definition of surveillance, but I want to keep it open. I also understand privacy in a way that allows for other kinds of interpretations. Some classical ideas being let alone, especially by the state. So privacy over against intrusion by the state. An aspect of personhood having to do with dignity and a sense of self, and that's where perhaps anthropological studies, certain psychological studies might help us. It can be understood as control over information, and certainly it is in so-called fair information practices that underlie much data protection and privacy law around the world. But the one that I think has become crucially important in the 21st century, and the Snowden revelations show this in a startlingly clear way, is that privacy should also be thought of as a social and political value for democracy. Within the idea of being let alone, sometimes privacy is seen as a kind of end in itself, a kind of value in its own right. And to an extent, I think one could interpret it that way, but seen as a means to an end of protecting and preserving democracy, to protect human rights, to avoid chilling effects. In that context, I think that it has potential that is as yet untapped. So, you want to know more about Edward Snowden? If you haven't yet seen the documentary that won an Oscar this year, Citizen 4, you should go and see the documentary. It's an excellent documentary, and she is an excellent filmmaker. And it's made in a way that really helps you to understand the issues. The framing that she does in the documentary is, I think, brilliant. I think it's just becoming more, it's out of the film festivals, it's in many theaters. It's on HBO, I think it's on iTunes from April. It's becoming more easy to get hold of. Check out the live streamed events that Snowden appears in, and you can check out obviously some of the past ones. Some of them are very interesting. And what you will see there is what I call the passion, the precision, and the principles of Snowden. When I started out trying to think about Snowden, I was very unsure about how I was going to, what conclusions I was going to come to about this person, who's the same age as our youngest daughter. But as I watched him, listened to him, read things he had said, I became very taken, very impressed with the passionate way in which he approaches these matters. He is not somehow just coolly, clinically detached. He is passionately involved. His precision. He is very careful to say what actually happens and what does not happen. And he's a journalist's nightmare because he is always being very careful to say, this is all we can say. We don't know more. So he's very careful, and I admire that. And he's also hugely principled. His ethical principles, I find astounding. His choice of civil disobedience while he was working at NSA, I found admirable in the reasoning the moral reasoning that he brought to the moment of actually deciding to make these disclosures. Very interesting character. And actually, I've ended up seeing him as a kind of model for appropriate response to things like mass surveillance. So much for the uncommitted, value-free social scientist. I think that what he did was a good thing. Look at the Snowden Surveillance Archive. That event in Toronto in March was the launch of the Snowden Surveillance Archive. And that's why he agreed to speak to the CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And we were that day launching the Snowden Surveillance Archive. This is an indexed archive of everything that has been revealed. So there's the link, and you can go there and check out in relation to specific countries, specific personalities, specific agencies. It's a very interesting developing archive, and I commend it to you because it's a research tool that we can all use. Oh yeah, my book was mentioned, and that is another source. So, Snowden, I'm concluding, I'm finishing, this is the end. Snowden sets an example of careful, courageous political action, in my view. The problem is everyone's. No one is exempt from what I've been talking about. No one can escape. We were joking this morning about the fact that Sue, my wife, and I do not carry a cell phone. People say, you dinosaurs. What's going on? Well, apart from anything else, it means that we don't carry PTDs, personal tracking devices. So it's sometimes a bit inconvenient to get in touch with us, but we don't carry personal tracking devices. I know they're marketed as smartphones, but they should have the generic name PTD, personal tracking device. It's everyone's issue, and even if you don't carry one, it's still your issue. There are many people who do not have Facebook accounts, for example, whose images still appear on Facebook because they're part of a group photo. Facebook, having by far the largest facial recognition software in the world, far bigger than the NSA, far bigger than any intelligence agency, has no problem in including your data from that face. So, you don't have to be on Facebook, you don't have to carry a cell phone, you're still involved. Sure. The issues, as I see it, are primarily ones of privacy understood as a human right with social and personal dimensions. They have to do with democracy, with politics, and justice. How we frame the future does make a huge difference. On the one hand, kind of paranoid paralysis of people who think, oh my gosh, this is too much for me. It just leads to a kind of paralysis or multifaceted engagement. And I think from what I've been saying, you know which I am arguing for. That's the book cover for you, and I have finished. Thank you very much. You're welcome to ask questions, and if you can ask them in English, it would help me a lot.
Thank you for coming, those of you.
Thank you for this amazing story of history of surveillance, the recent surveillance. I was wondering why it's really interesting the way you're putting things about political economy and surveillance and cooperation between states and of course a lot of cooperation, economic cooperation, including certainly I think economic war cooperation, right? So what I wonder is why the question about citizenship is not completely there when you mention about the human rights, because human rights justice is related as well. But citizenship will be important or not, because this is of course a global thing, and as you said, it's the materiality of the wires and the surveillance as well is quite amazing. But why citizenship is not important, or is just to I don't know, maybe out of the question? I don't know.
Yeah.
Whether it go next, and thank you. It's really interesting to know all your work.
So, you started by asking about the political economy question. So the connection between the political economy and the citizenship, is that what you want to speak about?
Just the wider, the concept of citizenship is not held in this, is because it's a global thing that is not good, or because it alters all the global. I mean, for example, Brazil at the moment Snowden appeared with this with all this evidence, because another thing you mentioned is that maybe we did know about the thing, but we didn't have the evidence there. So when the evidence appeared, Brazil was kind of doing a citizen state as well in terms of territories and not only human rights but also territorial and citizenship between the legacy beyond human rights, but of the legacy of own citizens.
Yeah, good. The questions of citizenship, I think, are really important. They're also really difficult because the character of citizenship can't be the same in the 21st century as it was in earlier decades. Partly because of the general processes that we call globalization, which frequently themselves have a political economy of their own, because it's frequently connected with neoliberal forms of political economy. But also because the surveillance that I've been discussing, as I say, is promiscuous. By definition, it goes beyond the conventional distinctions between citizens of one country and citizens of another. There isn't a distinction in the actual practices any longer. So the citizenship is a really important question. I should also say I'm not a political scientist. This is something that I think is really significant within political studies. But, okay. Two things. One is that I connect citizenship, or no, I connect the kinds of issues with which citizenship is concerned with rights, but not only rights, also with responsibilities. Rights in the sense that every human being, by virtue of being human, has worth that should be expressed in treating that person as having worth, which is what I think a human right is. It's not even a human right, it's a right. So that's the one thing, and I think it's crucially important in this area to think about rights, because so much has to do with the uneven surveillance of one group and another, because I wasn't talking about it this morning, but divisions between different groups and how we are sorted into different categories is crucial. So the divisions of surveillance themselves convey certain kinds of rights or deny certain kinds of rights. So that's one thing, but connected with the rights is the responsibilities. That is to say, I don't believe that we are
I don't think I've ever been through so many microphones. But the kind of positive connotation is that if privacy is what I suggest, a means towards democratic participation, then there are responsibilities, and the rights may not be thought of only as something that is kind of, as it were, received by groups. So there's a responsibility that I think is really important that goes with the rights. And the other thing is that in the world that we're talking about, which is a globalized and digital world, citizenship can't mean the same things as it did in pre-digital times. Because citizenship involves our participation online, it involves our participation with groups that we could not previously participate with because we were limited by geography, territory, and so on. So it seems to me that we have to understand citizenship in relation to the digital. And that involves a whole new way of thinking about citizenship, rights and responsibilities through the prism of political responsibility and of rights. So I just had an email yesterday saying that a book that was about to come out has now come out, and it's called Being Digital Citizens. And it's a great book. And it really sets out these things in a good way. Engadishan, who's the co-editor of Citizenship Studies, and Evelyn Ruppert, who is the editor of Big Data and Society, have come together to make this book. It's a really neat book. And so I commend Being Digital Citizens to you. It's now out and available. Okay, other questions or comments?
Yeah, I would like to know if do you think that with a new administration in the United States, it would be possible for Edward Snowden to get the forgiveness of the government?
Well, it's a good question. It's taken a long time for people to come to any kind of conclusion about Edward Snowden. Even some of the newspapers that carried news about his disclosures in a relatively positive way, it took until December 2014 for the New York Times to actually say that Edward Snowden ought to be repatriated and allowed to continue the work that he's doing now as an advocate for digital privacy and so on and so forth. It took the New York Times until December 2014 to think that this was a good plan, which struck me for the New York Times to be a very long moment. Of course, I think that I share the view that they now take. I think that it's difficult to answer that question because, for example, President Obama commissioned a study called the NSA report. And there are many things in that commissioned, multi-authored report that I think are tremendously appropriate for a post-Snowden world. So the report that he commissioned is actually contains many things that show why Snowden was right. And they connect, for example, civil liberties with privacy, connect political participation with privacy. Don't say, the report does not say that somehow we have to make a trade-off between liberties and security, which is frequently the story that governments say, oh, well, you can have more privacy or liberty, but then you'll have less security. Or you can have more security, but you've got to give up. That is such a nonsense. But it's there in the report commissioned by President Obama. So if it was left to Obama, I suspect that he would actually allow Snowden back. Whether whoever follows Obama will do so is another matter altogether. And we don't know if she will or not.
I just want to follow the line of reflection of my fellow colleague, Angeles Santillan, and I just want to add that probably what is happening is another paradox. The paradox that you have the impulse of the global in surveillance, which is contested by a discourse of citizenship that is not conciliated with that impulse of the global. So probably people are still reacting in terms of citizenship and an imaginary of citizenship that is no longer able to apprehend this new state of situation. Also, I just, besides that, I want to focus on the relevance, I think, that has the work of George Agamben on the one side, with the whole discussion of the exceptional forms of state, although they are not states, which is another complexity that I think we have to face, and the work of Deleuze. Probably right now we are seeing the quote-unquote true sense of what Deleuze was talking when he used the term society of control. Also, I want to focus on your discussion on the materiality of surveillance. There is a paradox for me. When you point out the materiality of surveillance, the cables, follow the cables, but it's a materiality that is in the service of something that is more and more abstract. So that paradox, I think that marks our time also.
Is that one question or about 13 questions? Yeah, I mean, no, I haven't said much about Deleuze, I haven't said much about Agamben. I think they're both very relevant. We work quite closely in surveillance studies with people in security studies, and therefore the Agamben connection is a good one, although Agamben himself made a very interesting intervention in Athens last year, and for the first time, perhaps for the first time ever, he spoke about some solid empirical matters, not only theory. Mr. Agamben is noted for his theoretical ideas, but not so much for his empirical. But it was interesting because he was talking about surveillance, and he was talking about biometrics in Athens in a speech last year. It's a very important speech, I think. But yeah, the state exception and the ways in which that works out in terms of security, crucial for everything that I'm saying. Totally think it's vital. It's amazing to me that one of the most frequently invoked concepts in the world today is security. At the same time, here's another paradox, at the same time, it is the most undefined concept available today. We have no idea what is meant by security, and yet it is somehow the concept to which people bow down, and that's what we've got to maintain. Something called security, usually qualified by the word national security, which of course deepens the problems with discussing what citizenship is in a globalizing and digital world. So, national security, all these things have huge ramifications. The Deleuze were, yes, and not only the society of control, but how it occurs, and that connects with your last point, how it occurs is through taking the in out of individual, or the in out of individuals, and creating individuals. So for Deleuze, the idea is that the old Western concept of liberalism, where you have a kind of abstract individual at the heart of political theory, is no longer appropriate because it isn't that individual who is even present anymore. It is the individuals. It is the creations of statistical reasoning. So that also connects, of course, with Foucault's biopolitics and so on. And the idea of the individual, I think, comes into its own with what I call big data surveillance, where, as I said, Google, Facebook social graph is the kind of iconic and easily understood metaphor for what goes on in the surveillance agencies, because it isn't the actual communications that we make anymore that are the most valuable forms of surveillance data. It is metadata, okay, that makes individuals. It's the statistical reasoning that creates these categories in which we find ourselves. And so, yeah, the concept of citizenship is sort of undermined by what we're talking about in the global context, but it's also undermined by, or older concepts of citizenship are also undermined by the fact that the abstract political animal, the agent, is no longer present in the actual forms of power that circulate within this global world. So, yeah, absolutely. I didn't talk much about theorists, partly because I was aware we were coming from different disciplines, and you know, we aren't always sharing the same theoretical origins. But in terms of the importance, I think that Agamben is tremendously important, especially for security studies, and therefore by extension to surveillance studies that are influenced by questions of security. And Deleuze is very important for his argument with, but yet his agreement with Foucault when it comes to questions of the panoptic and the post-panoptic and so on. And that is very, very important to think in terms of that going beyond the enclosure that Deleuze talks about. So yeah, good comments anyway. Great.
You mentioned that technology is a key and software of technology, and that historically the military has been extremely important in many developments, not only in this area. But my question is, private industry is also now courted a lot by the state. And does Snowden speak a lot to this matter, or can you mention anyone who does, or can you address it? And do these companies obviously spy on one another too, and what do we know about it?
Yeah. The Snowden revelations indicate that the boundaries between state surveillance and corporate surveillance are frequently invisible. It's hard to tell where one starts and the other finishes. For example, one of the early revelations in 2014 from Snowden showed extensive Canadian activities in surveilling Brazilian mining companies. And it had everything to do with the fact that because Canada is a very resource-rich country with many extractive industries that has branches throughout the world, mining among them. Canadian mining, seen as something that was somehow supportive of the Canadian economy, was seen as an important thing for our NSA, Canadian Communications Security Establishment. Sorry, I forget the names of what the acronyms stand for. Communications Security Establishment was engaged with what was basically industrial espionage in Brazil on behalf of mining corporations. It had zero to do with anything that you might even vaguely think had to do with national security, but it had everything to do with corporate interests. So yeah, absolutely, it's tremendously important. The earlier part of your question, you asked whether Snowden says anything about it. Snowden, as I say, is very reticent to say anything beyond what he knows from what he has seen in the documents and what he has understood. For now 31-year-old, I find him astonishingly knowledgeable, but he tends not to make too many comments. Where he does make comments to industry, to corporate entities, is within tech conferences. So he spoke at what's it called, South by Southwest, either last year or towards the end of 2013. And so he was addressing people who were involved in the industries, and he was speaking to them, talking about their responsibility as corporations within the world of surveillance. So he'll speak directly to those, but I haven't seen very much by way of him making comment on the corporate character of the of the overall surveillance machine. Do you want to add to that? Yeah.
No, yeah. What I really would like to know is access to new technology, obviously, is extremely important in this world of surveillance. And you mentioned that that's where our focus also ought to lie in terms of research. And that's sort of what I would like for you to go a little further into, if you could.
Mm-hmm. So, what sorts of research you mean? Yeah. I can only talk about a little bit of research that I did, because it relates. Okay, so with one of my PhD students, We did a study when we were looking at identification systems, and especially identification systems that are being sold to countries, to some country that is wanting to install a national identification system that involves citizenship cards for citizens and involves a massive database, a distributed database to provide a networked system of organizing national identification. And what we found is that the corporations work very closely with government, but that they frequently work through networks that represent them. So it's sometimes not the corporation itself that is representing the government, but some it's a sort of organization, a network that holds together different corporate interests. So the one that we're looking at is called Smart Card Alliance. Now the Smart Card Alliance is run by corporate CEOs, so the senior officials of the corporations, but it also has people within it who are from government, who have some responsibility within government for areas like this. You also find that those people change places. That is to say, the CEOs also are found in government. And government officials, maybe they retire from their position and they go to be a CEO of one of these corporations. And funnily enough, the contracts, well, I won't talk about the contracts, because that takes us even further into the complexity. But the contracts frequently go to the people who knew each other within these agencies. And here's the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things. We discovered that the Smart Card Alliance not only facilitates the possibility of selling national identification systems to specific countries, frequently, by the way, poorer countries in the Southern Hemisphere, but it also advises on policy. That is to say, the Smart Card Alliance has white papers, and they advise governments not just on how this system might work best once it is installed, but what their immigration policy ought to be in the first place, and what their crime management policy ought to be in the first place. And of course, funnily enough, it fits really well with the parameters of the system that they're selling. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. Smart Card Alliance is just one example, but that came out of our little piece of research.
I have just a brief comment and a question. I think two questions. One of the things I found it interesting about the presentation and the book was the fact that for a common citizen like myself, to understand the complexity of all these surveillance operations is sort of way beyond my head. And I think that at some point this discussion needs to be addressed in a way like you did today, which made more sense. It was, I don't know if you get to see the presentation of this British Oliver, interviewing Snowden, and he tried in a funny way to sort of explain, and it was interesting, one, that most, probably a lot of Americans don't know who he is or confused with somebody else, and so they didn't understand even the issue, so anyway, that was just a comment. But one of the things that interests me in the book that we read, or sort of, was the military dimension of this surveillance, and I think that if I don't recall, is that Bauman was talking about it, and you were sort of pulling him out of the military connection. I thought, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I do find that the connection is important because in a way it sort of treats everybody like a potential enemy. So therefore, you would think that the military connection, not just because it produces a lot of this technology, starting with ASP.NET, which gave origin to the internet, but also the fact that that it seems that this is like a militarized of civil life. So I would like you to comment on military. And also, one of the things that also interests me about that conversation was that when you talk about privacy, you thought, I believe that it was you, that, or you talked with Roman about how privacy wasn't really the most important issue, that the issue at stake was the fact that about this surveillance practice allowed different institutions to sort of make profiles of people, and those people at the same time were affected by this profile. I don't know if I paraphrase it well, but and that sort of gives some encourage, in a sense, it gave another level of poverty, social poverty. I don't know. Thank you.
So another complicated question. I'm just trying to think about the dimensions of it. So I'm grateful for the comment about how we understand these things. I totally agree. It is highly complex, and it's very difficult to get your head around what Snowden has revealed. It is complex, and it does need for systematic forms of analysis from all the disciplines that we have mentioned. So I do think that's important. Was it the John Oliver show that... I've lost my question there now. Oh yeah. So this John Oliver one?
Yeah.
The comedian. The guy who tries to turn the news into a kind of comic form.
It was interesting.
Yeah. Because he's also trying to show how important the issues are through his show. So but it was interesting to me when I saw that he ended up reducing the issues to what seemed to me to be tremendously trivial level in order to make sense to a broad audience, which I guess his main audience is in the US, and maybe lots of people do exchange naked photographs of themselves with others online, but really, if we have to reduce the conversation to that level, then how are we ever going to get it back to where it needs to be? And I was troubled by that because, also you saw Snowden hesitating so often because he didn't know where he was going with this comedian, talking with him, and if you haven't seen it, he's a very in-your-face comedian, and poor Snowden. I felt sorry for him in that show. But really, I think there are ways of making the issues accessible, and there are important ways of showing how our own participation in smartphone use and in internet use is exactly what is being used for surveillance purposes in creating these patterns of activity, of who we communicate with, for how long, with what purpose, all those kinds of things. Those are the metadata that are so crucial for state surveillance today and also for corporate surveillance. So yeah, I agree with you that it's difficult to work out the best way to communicate on some issues that are tremendously important today. On the Batman thing, I understand that several people have read the conversation between me and Zygmunt Bauman. And I mean, one thing I should say is a genuine conversation. So soon my wife and I went to visit an elderly friend a few years ago, just after his wife, Janina, died. Okay, so she died after they had been married for 62 years. And it took him 9 days after he met her to ask her to marry him. And then they were married for 62 years. Hey. Anyway, we went to see him in his home and to talk with him, see how he's doing, and so on. Of course, he lives in England, we live in Canada. And out of that conversation in his home, we started talking about surveillance issues, and then when we continued with the email, at one point I said to him, you know what, I wonder whether people would be interested in hearing the conversation that we are having. So how about if we actually extend it and see if our publisher, because we both work for the same publisher, would be interested in publishing it? Well, of course, they wanted to. They thought it was a good idea. So then the conversation went on, but then we were also aware that we were going to eventually turn it into something that could be published. And but we didn't edit it. So it's pretty much as it came out. I only edited it a bit to put things in sections so that it would be a bit more coherent. But there was only a couple of phrases that I moved around. So it was a real conversation. And so, yes, of course, I was pushing him at some points, and he was responding very firmly to me. I mean, I have a huge respect for my friend. He will be 90 years old this November, and I have huge admiration for him, but I also profoundly disagree with him on some things, and I was pushing him on those, and especially on something that used to be important to his work very strongly in the 1970s, 80s, when I first knew him, which came from his kind of Gramscian, humanist, Marxist phase, and he was full of hope for the potential for political action against the managerial state. And really, the managerial state is what we now see in the NSA. It's the managerial state gone digital, and in my view, gone out of control. But he was arguing for that, and so in the book, I was saying to him, but there are still possibilities for political action. There are still possibilities even for ways in which we can affect legal change that can constrain certain kinds of activities. There are ways in which in so many ways that there is still possibility. And I think the way that he is now framing things denies some of that earlier hope for human creativity, human agency, political action that he used to argue for back in the 1980s. And I still think that underneath, it's still there. But I couldn't get him to say it. Anyway, that was the discussion that I had. And yeah, the question of the military and the violence, I think it's just as you say. So I agree with your comment. I think that is what he was trying to do there. And he sees many dimensions of surveillance, but he also has some wonderfully astute observations of how it connects with the big themes that he talks about, like consumerism, like liquidity, of course, the liquid surveillance, which is what we were conversing about in a sense. So yeah, all those things, it seems to me, are really important themes, but the point at which I was sorry that I couldn't push him further was this matter of political agency, human creativity, the possibilities that remain for political action. And you know what? Apart from anything else, if you want to see an example of somebody who has made a difference, then look at Edward Snowden. This 29-year-old rocked the world. Why are we imagining that somehow you can't make a difference by principled, ethically informed, courageous action? This guy's made a huge difference. You all came to the lecture today because it's about Mr. Snowden. I mean, so, you know, and of course he's just one case, but I think there are huge possibilities there. I've drifted right away from your question, and I apologize. Maybe we can talk about it later.
Good morning. A week from now, the government is going to pass the renewal of the Patriot Act, and it's very scary that only a small consensus of United States citizens know about it, and we're just gonna let it pass by, and it's scary because even though it's supposed to not affect us at all, it's programmed to more rigorous. It's more rigorous, and it's planned to basically affect by that sometimes it's made to pass by as something that we're going to go abroad, but it comes back into the United States, and I want to ask if there's going to be a point, or is there any chance of getting even a small or even a bigger consensus on this act, to see or get more people to know about it and be more informed, because as we saw, piggybacking on what she said, and the John Oliver talk show, he talked of even when he started asking people through the streets, he even though the only way that they found out that what they were talking about was from a very not a very pretty way to find out how NSA works, but it's scary that we have to get to that level so people could understand, and basically even though they explain it that way, that's only like 1/10 of the part that NSA works, and what I thought that was the most important part of the interview, even though that he tried to make it funny, was that how each system in the NSA works, and how many ways does the NSA has like he said, sheriffs, so they can get information from you. Even though you can skip by one, you can't skip the other. Even though you maybe in Google you will appear in Facebook, and maybe 10 minutes from now you appear back on Google. And what I wanted to ask is that will there be a chance for the Patriot Act to be changed or basically altered in a way that we know doesn't let that what you talked about the difference between liberty and security, so people understand that we're at a point that we basically can't. We want more security, but we're losing liberty. And I'm in a social sciences class, and we're reading your liquid surveillance book, and it's scary that even though more technology that we get refined, we want more efficiency. We're basically just leaking the government into our homes and into our lives, and basically the panoptic eye that's watching us just went from eye in the sky to an eye following us everywhere.
Right, I get it. Good question. Okay. One thing that your question does is to point out that there are certain kinds of concepts, certain kinds of, not even a concept, but it's active, it's part of the world, become tremendously important in framing what we are supposed to think are priorities. So efficiency is one of those. Efficiency, in my understanding, is not a value at all. It is of value for some purposes, but it is not in itself some kind of value that is worth giving your life for. This is not something you die for. Efficiency. It's a recent invention in the Western world, and you see it in the machine culture of the 19th century, and you see it in the computer culture, digital world of today. How do we end up making efficiency this thing that is worth dying for? You know, as I understand it, things that are worth dying for are caring for your neighbor. If you give up your life for somebody else who's in trouble, then that is a value. That's worth going for. Efficiency, you know, so your question points out that there are some things that we think are hugely important because the newspapers and the TV and the internet talks about them the whole time, but frequently I think they are trivial and not really what our human lives are meant to be all about. Anyway, that's one thing. The Patriot Act and the return of the reinstatement of the Patriot Act. I have not claimed at any point that the kinds of odds up against which people who are concerned for democratic practice in the 20th century are not huge. That there are huge obstacles in the way of any kind of political activity. That is not something I'd argue at all. I think there are huge obstacles, and they are entrenched, and they are global, and they are enormous. But they're not beyond hope. So, and I think it's important to remember that. I'm not an American. I've never been an American. And I don't think I ever will be an American. But I live in Canada, and I'm Canadian. And we have something very similar happening in Canada. So I'm not going to comment on the Patriot Act directly, but I'm going to comment on your question. In Canada, we have been arguing for the past few months about a bill which is called C-51. Our acts always have very innocent-sounding, letter numbers. So C-51, and C-51 is basically allowing the government to create a secret police state. It allows for an amazing access of police and intelligence agencies to the data of individuals that they did not have before, that they can get without a judicial warrant. It's easy, you can find lots of debate on this in Canada. And so it turns into a situation very like the Patriot Act. And it's highly secretive. They are not expected to respond to public opinion or anything. And it's secretive also in the sense that there is no properly organized oversight into the activities of the agencies who will be allowed to have these new powers, which are essentially an extension of what we were talking about this morning, that's been revealed on Snowden in relation to the NSA. So it's allowing those powers and actually making legal some things that have already been happening illegal. So it's very like the Patriot Act. And what I see in Canada, which, as you know, is has had a very powerful right-wing conservative government for a number of years, and has entered into a very close relationship with post-9/11 Patriot Act kinds of activities in the United States, and even stronger support, for example, of Israel than the United States currently has. Obama questioned Netanyahu just before the Israeli election in March. No question in Canada. Netanyahu was our man. So there are issues that we can raise there. So yeah, Patriot Act in Canada. But there is opposition to this. And so I wonder where exactly the opposition is going to come from in the US, and I don't really know. although it is there, there are very strong forms of opposition, and there's some wonderful, clear, persuasive, compelling opponents of that return of the Patriot Act. In Canada, what we've seen is the growth of coalitions of groups who are opposed to our C-51. And that has been very interesting and quite exciting. It comes under the umbrella of the openmedia.ca. So we have an internet NGO that is coordinating opposition to this bill. And it's very interesting to see the huge growth of opposition, which was relatively small at first, because, like so many countries, a large public will say, oh, if it's going to help national security, we're in favor of it, without knowing what the details are at all. And so there was very little information about it at first, and the government was trying to pass it very rapidly. And now there is a huge concerted operation against it. I don't know what is going to be the final result of it, but we have had the largest online petitions, online petitions, demonstrations, manifestations, right across Canada, out in the streets against this bill. There is a huge groundswell of grassroots opposition to this thing. I don't know whether it's going to work, because the current government is led by a very clever and very powerful leader. But there is a lot of political activity around it, as there will be, and as there has been in the States, but it's not as concerted as it is in Canada. So they, obviously it's an open question, but that there are forms of opposition that one sees. And then if you look in Europe, the opposition to post-Snowden surveillance is much more concerted and much more effective in the actual changes at a high level. So, for example, through the Council of Europe, there are some very interesting changes that are being proposed there. And a general thing, you talked about being in the social sciences. Just let me respond to that. In the social sciences, there's always been a tension between doing social science and being politically active. In my view, it is always the case that the social sciences, because they are about the ways in which human beings operate, the ways in which we live our lives, human beings are part of what is, human beings are the audience for social science work, and it's the hope of social scientists that their work will make a difference. And if you don't hope your work will make a difference, what are you doing it for? Really? Why would you do it if you don't hope that it's going to make a difference? And you hope that one way that it will make a difference will be if you can express the ideas, the theories, the concepts, the work, the research that you're doing in ways that a broad audience can understand, then other people can join in and understand that it doesn't have to be this way. There are alternatives. What you've been given is not everything there is. So I think there's a way in which we're inevitably political creatures within the social sciences. And while we can do careful research, we can do empirical research, we can use concepts and theories in responsible ways, it doesn't mean that somehow we are not also political agents. And I see no way that we can separate those different roles that we play. So I do work in surveillance studies, which I hope is reputable and reliable and careful and all those kinds of things that good social science should be. But I also, because I do it, I sign my name to declarations against things like Bill C-51. So you can see it online. David Lyon is one of the people listed in the opponents to this bill. And there are good reasons for opposing it. And I think we have to work out again what that relationship between social sciences and political action is in today's world, because again, it's something that has been affected by our digital world and the ways that we engage that. I also think, by the way, that we need to work together with journalism much more in the social sciences than we have done in the past. The connections are far stronger than they have been in the past. And I think the journalism, social science connections are crucially important ones for us to think about as well. That wasn't in your question, so I've obviously gone beyond the question that I was supposed to answer. So thank you for the question. That's great.
Okay, friends, sadly we're running out of time. We're going to allow our 3 next turns that we already separated to make a quick, please quick, and simple question and comment, and then allow for a single answer to the 3 questions or comments, okay?
I'll be quick as well.
Since I'll make this real quick, you already kind of started answering my question. It's a more of like a hypothetical type of question, counterfactual. How can we control the power of these organizations that are using mass surveillance, like for example, the Five Eyes Partners and other organizations that obviously do exist, but we don't know about them. Where can we draw the line of what should be public knowledge to those organizations and what should be private, since there's no line that has been drawn for what could be known for those organizations and what can't be known, since the technology is not really regulated by any type of law, since it's something new. How can we basically say, okay, this is where we draw the line, this is what you can know, this is what you can't know. And since also the definition of security is always changing, every year it changes because of new different problems and dilemma in the international world and also in states, how can those types of definitions not be blurred out? And I guess I just...
I have everything fine. I have a quick question. I did my bachelor's degrees in electrical engineering, and now I'm doing my master's in journalism, because all the work you have available when you're at the university is in the private sector, military sector. And I think journalists, the thing I like about Citizen4 was that she was aware of how she needed to protect herself on the information. I think we lack that kind of education nowadays in the university. And I was wondering, like, right now there's the debate going on about making internet a public good, a public commodity. And there's been very little dialogue in the island about that. And I was wondering, what does that mean, if anything, in this paradigm that you've just presented? Thank you.
The case of Edward Snowden, is there the following interpretation possible, that Edward Snowden is a case that demonstrates not a problem of surveillance and violation of privacy rights and human rights. It's a political problem in 2 dimensions. That we have come to the state of state of things because the political party system has been subverted. The political party system in the United States and in Puerto Rico, the elites have withdrawn from democratic accountability. And in turn, political parties in the United States, I imagine in Europe and in Puerto Rico, the political parties have lost their political base. In turn, the political party system in the United States, it has been transformed. And that includes that the elites have been able to migrate from responding to the political base. They have migrated, the decision making and the elites have migrated to institutions, be they financial banks or regulatory agencies. They have migrated not from the political base, they have migrated to, and the decision-making progress has migrated to insulated agencies that do not have to respond to political accountability, nor do they have to respond to other types of pressures from that which democracy defends, the majority. So the Snowden case, does it seem to you as a new dark age in which we can sense a sense of citizens having lost power? Political basis, the political power has shifted, and the stage is set for a future political crisis, a future political struggle. And Snowden reveals to us how power has been shaken from the political base, citizenship, and it's transformed to institutions and elites that do not have to respond to majority pressure. The majority being the essence of democracy. If you think you might comment.
Good question. Okay, so 3 questions and 3 answers relatively quickly. How can we participate in controlling the corporations and the agencies that I've been talking about, especially with the increasing confusion between so-called public and private information, and whether attempts to create the internet as a new kind of entity are appropriate. There's an awful lot that could be said about that concept of privacy, the public-private, and how we deal with that. I used to be far more negative about using the word privacy in this context because of its origins in kind of Western liberal understandings of the individual. It was a very abstract concept, frequently connected with property, and so on and so forth. And for a long time, I argued that the kinds of surveillance that we confront today are ones that cannot be argued about or argued against using a concept like privacy. It's simply inadequate for the task. But what I've seen over the past 15 years or so, and particularly the last 7-10 years, is that many more people today are using the concept of privacy in new ways that relate much more to what I was saying about seeing privacy as a means towards certain kinds of political ends, and not merely in relation to that kind of individualized, abstract notion of the solitary individual in political theory. And I think that understanding in that broader way makes it possible to form coalitions of interest in opposing surveillance that weren't possible before. And so I think there are ways in which one can actively engage politically across a coalition of interests that may still use the concept of privacy, but is using it in a way that has been infused with new definition that isn't limited to the abstract. And so in that way, I think there are opportunities for engaging both with agencies through government oversight and so on and so forth, using the tools that are already there in government, weak though they are, trying to strengthen those tools for oversight, transparency, and so on and so forth. And equally within the corporations, there's work to be done. We can use the kinds of concepts that are already used by the corporations. Things like corporate social responsibility, which is frequently a sort of a smoke screen for letting the corporation do what it really wants to do anyway. It can be infused through whatever means. I mean, there are shareholders in corporations. There are users of corporate services, platforms, the telecoms companies, and so on and so forth. They don't want to get a bad reputation And they want their systems to work and to be appreciated by those who use them. So I think there are opportunities using various kinds of tools, sometimes the very tools that those entities, government agencies, corporations, already advertise as part of what they do. I think we can use those and turn them into far better use the word weapons, but that sounds like we're back to
higher level of social responsibility.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Higher level forms of social responsibility, exactly. I love the fact that you're from electrical engineering. This is good. So, question of how to protect ourselves. I didn't say anything about that at all. Mr. Snowden says quite a lot about that. And Mr. Snowden also will name the kinds of programs that he believes are particularly useful in protecting individual users and sometimes system users, like within an organization, from unwarranted and unwanted intrusion and use. There are various kinds of entities that he'll talk about, including that one from March that I mentioned, from the CBC in Canada when we launched the Surveillance Archive. So he does actually talk directly about packages that are available for self-protection. But every time he speaks about those packages, he will also say, while these are good and they may provide some protection to individuals, they are not the solution to the problem that I've been indicating. Because he does not believe that there are technological solutions to political and social problems, any more than I do, any more I hope you do. And so he will say, yes, these are good in a limited way. My own view is that frequently they, well again, most of us don't have technological competence, like our friend who asked the question, no doubt does from a background in electronic engineering. Great, but most of us don't have that expertise, so we're limited. Also, these systems nearly always cost money, and certainly the better ones at the moment on the market are ones that frequently have a price tag attached to them. Therefore, they're not accessible to everyone to use. Now, there are some open source ones, and Snowden will always point to the open source ones if they're available, but it's not taken for granted. And then, of course, there is that problem. We tend so quickly in a society that is infused with technology to think that there's an app for that. There is not an app for that. There is human beings acting in creative ways with their agency, wisdom from whatever, shared with others, working corporately to try to develop these sorts of things. And that's what Snowden actually talks about. Might become more impressed with the way that he talks in those kinds of ways. So, yeah, great question. Thank you. I don't know if I've answered it, but it's a good question. Yeah, the question of the politics. I mean, your question was a really good mini lecture in itself. I agree with what you were saying there, and I think that what Snowden has shown is exactly that it has thrown light on things that we had suspected but didn't realize were going on in quite the extent to which they really are, or with the technological sophistication, or with the apparent impunity that you can somehow get away with doing things that are illegal, unconstitutional, and just basically unjust, to give the bottom line, simply unjust. So I think that all that you were saying is correct. It's very easy to underestimate the kinds of things that Snowden has revealed, and very easy to sort of push them into another department. Like, oh, well, that's a privacy question. Let's tinker with some legal requirements, and as if that's going to make all the difference. I think that some of the things that we see very clearly that are happening through the surveillance that Snowden has revealed is political repression. And recognizing that that is what actually is going on is really important. And I don't think that my earlier comments about privacy deny that, because I think we can use already existing concepts that mobilize opposition to surveillance without falling into the trap of using them in a way that, you know, the narrow, individualistic, abstract, blah, 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 kind of definition would. They can be infused with new content and can be used against the political repression that is represented in what Snowden has revealed. I don't know if I'm still talking sense. We've been going a long time. I think I'm very grateful for your questions. They're very great questions. And I'm so glad to have been here. Muchas gracias.